Hello, Internet. It's time for another Wednesday serial, and with the recent story arc, Ends of the Earth, it got me thinking about where Dr. Octopus has been as a character, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. So the classic understanding of Dr. Octopus is just kind of an older scientist, crazy weird goggles usually, and then usually a lab coat or like the spandex getup depending. But really it's kind of an interesting idea because usually you have this mad scientist idea or whatever, but usually people tend to do things on their own. It's interesting because he's literally a body suspended by what's making him this villain beyond his mind. And all the fighting's done by the tentacles, and that's been handled in many different ways. I found the second movie's interpretation really interesting, that the tentacles actually kind of speak to him and make him a little crazy, that they're always talking to him. But there's some weird things about that, and I'm sure that's played in at the comics one point, mostly around when the movie was coming out, and since hasn't necessarily been the case, but certainly usually the mad scientist type. It's also interesting to note that recently, starting in Slot's run, that Dr. Octopus has just been ravaged by time, ravaged by what he's done to himself, and now, more than before, he's really just a body suspended by his constructs. He's made something work for him despite essentially being more or less enfeebled by his natural body. He's very much a technological being, and that's really interesting to see. And I'm curious, I know for a while he was the villain of an Iron Man arc, but I didn't read it. It was right before I dropped Iron Man, and now I'm kind of curious if anyone has anything positive to say about that arc, to see if maybe there are some interesting comparisons drawn there, as Iron Man is a suit and whatnot. But as a villain, he's had a very sordid past, from just being kind of a villain of the week to kind of being more of a canonized villain of Spider-Man's, to at one point having tried to wed Aunt May. That was an interesting one, and played a couple interesting ways, but that was dropped and more or less forgotten. Up to this arc, where he makes a very interesting transition that only one Spider villain has really done before him, and that is become a worldwide threat, and thusly become a threat on the scale that he's someone who could fight the Avengers. Now, we've seen spider villains transcend scales before. Actually, more notably, much longer ago, Venom was one. And that's interesting to note, A, because most of these ones that tend to go up tend to be kind of the arch nemesis because they're the more popular villain, and for that they gain popularity, then they kind of go beyond that scope. Venom's interesting because as a villain, he's really one note. He's made for some very interesting stories, but with Eddie Brock and all that, he actually got a lot of face time, a lot of different minis and short-lived ongoings as his own character, which a number of people seem to find interesting. But as a villain, he really only had so much depth, and that was exemplified with Carnage, who is even more one note, but created a much more interesting idea of a villain as a serial killer gone rampant. It's essentially a weaponized serial killer who is the living embodiment of a weapon, is what Carnage is. And so to see that be a Spider-Man villain is interesting, because Spider-Man has always been, now more so than ever, no one dies. So I mean, that's a juxtaposition right there that's interesting on a moral stance, almost, except that it's so, cut and dry, right? But the idea of Carnage going up against someone like the Avengers, or maybe more interesting like Weapon X, could be an interesting dichotomy. I mean, this idea of killers and all that, and then like him being the worst kind. I actually think Carnage would make a more interesting Captain America villain at this point, as someone who's brought up with all the worst parts of Americana and what America can really represent in some ways, and see Captain America fight that. Venom has since been twisted into kind of a dark shadow of Spider-Man thematically, with Flash Thompson being part of that too. And that's so tied to Spider lore, but it being a step away from it actually allows the book to be stronger. Those are the two villains that have really expounded first from the Spider canon. Now, more notably, and as I'm sure a lot of you have thought, Norman Osborn, Green Goblin, is really the big Spider villain to go beyond. Marvel felt they needed a Lex Luthor-esque villain to be on the scale of an Avengers villain and whatnot, and they've certainly played around with that and done a lot of different things. And in a lot of ways, it's made the character more interesting, but you'll notice he went more or less from being the Green Goblin to being the Iron Patriot, to kind of make that shift in villain status. Notoriety, I guess would be the word, right? But it's interesting to see that, and with that villainous jump, he goes from being a Spider-Man villain, which by all rights, a Spider-Man villain, like, robs a bank, will put Manhattan in danger and all this. Spider-Man isn't so much a save the world kind of guy, which is pointed out in this arc as well. Which is why it's so interesting to see Dr. Octopus be brought to this level and still be the Spider-Man villain. It makes the villain much more comically villainous, which I think is part of the reason why this arc didn't resonate with people too much, because a villain can only be so evil before it's so diabolically evil that it's comical, right? Like, the idea of someone wanting to destroy the Earth makes no sense if they're of the Earth. Why would you want to... It makes no sense. Why would you want to destroy humanity if you're of humanity? Control, cleanse in some ways, yes, those are all villainous things that we wouldn't resonate with, but we can understand what they're doing and why it's bad, and why in their eyes they'd want to do it. But a lot of that, like, old Golden Age stuff, I mean, just being a comically bad villain is something we're more or less past, and I think that's, again, why this didn't resonate so well, is Dr. Octopus wants to really destroy at least most of the population of Earth and watch it burn, and then become the most notorious murderer of all time. And I'd argue it doesn't make sense to his character, except for the fact that they set up this whole idea of him being ravaged and him wanting to be remembered, and with him being so somewhat villainous before it almost makes sense, but I think it does kind of cross that line. Another interesting thing to note is kind of the idea of falling in line, which was a big theme in Ends of the Earth, in which Dr. Octavius makes kind of the general public fall in line, and also he has the Sinister Six, each with their own motivations, fall in line with him. And then that's more akin with Spider-Man getting the Avengers to fall in line with him. Most of that's earned and kind of canonized, if you will. Like, he's a member of the Avengers and they trust him. They're dealing with Dr. Octopus. And it wasn't so much a part of the story, but as a part of the character, it's a much bigger thing as opposed to just paying someone off or giving someone what they want. Like, it has a bit more resonance, right? And then, like I said, with Dr. Octopus, he's just paying people off, but then he gets people on his side with kind of a false promise. And that's really interesting. And then when it comes down to it, seeing how Spider-Man is able to have some people fall in line. And it's interesting to see both of these characters in this scenario where there's the highest stake moment, essentially, of their lives, that the spotlight's on them, because both of them have been part of bigger things where the scales were even a bit higher. But with them being the central players, this is the biggest time for them. And then to see how they kind of have to step up and lead. Now, that's not necessarily the case, as Dr. Octopus has been the leader of the Sinister Six before, but he's never really been a leader. He's just rounded up some villains to be some thugs for him, essentially. this time he did actually take a point where there wasn't like so much a falling line, or they weren't just trying to kill Spider-Man. It was something a touch more, and for that, and with it playing and actually being a theme of the story, it was a touch more interesting. Now, another falling point of this storyline it's been brought up that this is kind of like the Tower of Babel JLA storyline by Mark Waid, where Batman has all these plans to take down the Justice League should it come to that, and he has all these preparations for that. And in this case, Spider-Man had all this tech, and then it's being used to take down the Avengers. Now, this is a theme and a device that's been used before that predates comics, I'm sure, but what's weird here is that he was doing all these things for the betterment of the planet, and then it was being used as a way to stop the Avengers. He didn't actually plan on stopping the Avengers, because that's not something Spider-Man would really do, right? And so it was kind of weird that he had all these inventions that lined up with that. I think if it was led into a bit stronger within the comics prior or something, it might have had it, but I do have to admit this does feel like a bit of a falling point of the comic, as it just seems like a cheap way to kind of herald some older stories, and I see what the idea is to go for, is that, you know, all of his good intentions have been turned against him, which is a interesting way to play with it. But since this was such a global story to begin with, if you saw his inventions kind of maybe being put as a threat to the Earth instead of a threat to the Avengers, I think it might have resonated better. Another thing that I'm kind of torn on in this arc is the use of female characters. For most of the arc, Spider-Man's running around with Black Widow and Silver Sable, and while it's cool to have strong female characters and they're doing a lot, at the same time, they're kind of falling in line with Spider-Man, and there's no way to avoid that. It's a Spider-Man title. But at the same time, you know, it's women, you know, they're not subservient or anything like that, but it is kind of odd, and it starts to play more to like a weird, like, sexual power angle, if you will, kind of, you know, like the man's in charge and these women are helping him out, these two hot foxy ladies, and it's kind of weird for a Spider-Man comic for it to be done that way, I think, which is kind of interesting in that usually, you know, it's the women at home that are pining for him or whatever, and that, I guess that's so canonized I don't really even think about it, but here it was so oddball that it kind of got me thinking like that. I guess I'd kind of like to see, you know, a nice Black Cat story where it's more on the level, but I guess that was done in Daredevil, in a way. So, I don't know, if anyone has any deeper thoughts on that, I can't really make up my mind where I feel about that. Another thing that was interesting was this fake out where the Mysterio concocted this idea that the Earth had burned, and then you feel the effect of that, but they spend a lot of time on this fake out. At first I felt it was kind of unjustified, as, you know, it's a fake out and they spend all this time on it for it to just be Mysterio's kind of coup de grace moment in the book for each one of the Sinister Six, and I thought about it a little more, and it was a bit more clever. I mean, yes, it's a fake out and all that, but it allows us to see the emotion and what that means, and kind of the thoughts of what if the world ended, what would Spider-Man do, where would he be at, and then see him come to the realize that that's not the case and how he deals with that. And it kind of gets at the character moment that so much of this is about. I mean, he's fighting for no one to die now, so what if everyone died? Where does that put him? And you see this moment of just despair until he can't help. I mean, and that's the bit that I think really brings up Peter Parker, makes him relatable to a certain chunk of people, is that even at the worst of time, he can't help think, and he can't help but think kind of positively, or if this is terrible, then it can't be true, or why can't it be true? Just kind of thinking about it until he comes to realization, then finds a way through. Kind of like that idea that, you know, it's this or this, but you'll die, but if you do this, maybe there's a slight chance that you'll survive with a little bit of luck, then you go that way. And despite him being brilliant and knowing all the supposed possibilities, if there is no for sure answer, he's going to push past that, which is why I think Spider-Man isn't necessarily more heroic than any other standard superhero, but I think it's written so much better, or it feels like he's more heroic for that trait. It's just a way that you see what he's pushing past and then what he's going through, and that's what makes it so gratifying when, you know, third act comes around. So a lot of this arc was writing on the very ending, and no one dies. Well, someone dies, but it's a worthy sacrifice or whatever. It's kind of ham-fisted the way it's delivered. But we also have this moment where, for it all, Dr. Octopus, the whole crux of this is that he's going to die anyways. His body's done. He's burnt out. He's going to die at this set amount of time, and he wants to have this happen before he dies. And then at the end, Spider-Man just kind of throws him away and then puts him on life support, I guess. And so for that, he's going to live through. It seemed like at the end of this, Dr. Octopus had to die, and die unfulfilled. And it would be in a way, a really interesting victory, in a way to make a kind of hollow victory, in the fact that a man's dead, he was going to die anyway from natural causes, and all his evil has been stopped. But nonetheless, a man's dead. Which, if it was like any other character, the morality and the play of that would be like, whatever. But with Spider-Man, he's a little bit too much of a paragon for that to not go unnoticed. For someone he knows that closely, one way or another, to perish would affect him. And it's kind of sad, and I understand there's a whole continuity reason why they wouldn't do this, but this wouldn't be the first time. And that's what I find kind of odd, is that the last time Dr. Octopus died, he died at the hand of Kane, who's still running around and has his own book. And the fact that Doc Ock didn't want a piece of that, didn't want revenge in some way from being so comically villainous, for it to not even be mentioned seems so odd. A good chunk of that might be because Marvel kind of wants to pretend that never happened. It's during the era of Spider-Man that more or less should be forgotten. But I think that's a way to give some relevance to that moment. Though, then if you bring that up, you kind of have to bring up the fact that he was resurrected by the hand. I never read it. I don't want to read too much into it. If someone knows about it, I'd like to hear about it. But Doc Ock was killed by Kane. Then there was this female Dr. Octopus running around that was an old student of his, and she worshipped him, and she seemed more crazy for that. And I think that would be a cool character to keep around. But yeah, then the hand resurrected her, and she just kind of relinquished the title, I guess. Maybe they kept her around for a bit. I seem to remember a cover, but whatever. Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to play with. If you're looking on death and you'd been resurrected, how can you not play in that theme, it's my time, I didn't die that time because it wasn't my time, but now, give that a little resonance. Though I do feel it's interesting, kind of as I said, that this is supposed to be a monumental Spider-Man story just because of the timing. It's a big anniversary for Spider-Man. This was supposed to be a big deal. And what other villain would they use but Dr. Octopus? I mean, there's no other Spider villain that really kind of hits so many of the themes on the head. And I find it odd, because I always kind of considered Dr. Octopus to be Spider-Man's more natural arch nemesis. I always preferred him as a villain. That's just preference. But I mean, it's this idea of young versus old, or like science for good versus evil, or like the idea of corporate versus independent, if you can kind of look at Dr. Octopus as corporate, or even the idea of like sick science, more than I said so before. Like, the arms are like strapped onto his back because of his own twisted deal, whereas Spider-Man was bit by a spider, as you know, and then became Spider-Man, and a lot of the technology that he's done is reactionary and for good and a natural evolution, whereas Dr. Octopus tries to force things for his own benefit. And so it seems like there's a lot of ways to play it and play with the characters and the ideas that they represent, whereas, and also there's the whole animal thing, or the idea of an octopus versus a spider, you know, different legs, I don't know, but an animal totem sort of representation fighting. Whereas a lot of the other spider villains I don't really feel represent as much. Like I said, Venom and Carnage, not as much. I understand Spider-Man's personal responsibility feeling towards Venom, but I feel that's kind of been absolved at this point. And then the Green Goblin I never felt was as good of a fit. They have a lot of personal ties and whatnot, but I just always felt that the less they played with that, the better. In a lot of ways, as far as goblins go, I thought the Hobgoblin or Dean Goblin was more interesting, but those characters are more or less forgotten right now, though I think we'll see the Hobgoblin come back in a bit. The Tarantula was never really played well, the Rhinos too on the nose, and so on. I mean, Kraven's had his day, though they're trying to bring him back. I do really like the Lizard, and I got into a debate that got me kicked off some forums before, but I'm really curious to see what they're going to do with the Lizard in the upcoming arc, given that they did so much with him in the Shed arc that really the twist that they usually use to calm the Lizard down is gone. Yeah, so, but when it comes to just like a classic archetypal battle, I really can't imagine anyone better suited than Dr. Octopus to be fighting Spider-Man. If you think there's a better matchup for Spider-Man, I'd certainly like to hear it. So yeah, comments, questions, likes, dislikes, all that below.